and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Hi, Helen. How are you doing today?
Hi, Tom. I'm great, thank you. You?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very excited to be doing our first full podcast, and I'm keen to get underway. So what are we talking about today, Helen?
In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the person-centred approach to coaching. So let's start with, what is the person-centred approach to coaching?
The person-centred approach to coaching is what underpins almost all the coaching that people do. Even if they have never heard of person-centred coaching, they are probably using a person-centred approach. So if people describe themselves as a non-directive coach, that's what they will be using. So the phrase non-directive started with a therapist called Carl Rogers, who was active in the middle part of the last century, and he took a humanistic approach to therapy. And he coined the phrase non-directive to describe what he was doing, because he wasn't trying to direct his patients, he was trying to draw answers out of them. He actually moved away from the phrase non-directive and started calling it person-centred, because he felt non-directive was a bit negative, trying not to do something. But it has obviously carried on within the coaching world that we're trying not to direct our clients. And so we use a person-centred approach where we are looking at their agenda and trying to draw the answers to the problems they have out of them, rather than us giving them the answers.
So totally focused on the person in front of us.
Yeah, and what it is they want to talk about. So if you are coming as a coach to the coaching room with your own agenda, that's clearly not person-centred. And I sometimes see that in organisations where the organisation has an idea of what the coachee needs to focus on, and the coach is trying to shoehorn them into being how the organisation wants them to be. But for pure coaching, we are generally using a person-centred approach.
So would you say that focus on the client, the coachee, and their agenda is the defining element of this approach?
I think the defining element of the person-centred approach is the space that exists within the coaching. So it's all about really good listening, about empathy, about leaving lots of time and space for the client to do really good thinking. So one of the things that I wasn't really aware of when I first heard about person-centred coaching, and my original training was very person-centred, my tutor was a person-centred coach, but what I didn't realise till years later was that Carl Rogers, in his work, never really asked any questions. So he would introduce a therapy session, by saying, "I'm curious to know what it is you'd like to talk about." So wasn't really asking a question. And then throughout his therapy, he would just play back what was being said by the patient. In coaching, that's a great way to be. So if we can listen to what's being said, offer that space for people to talk, and once they've finished talking, play back in some way. So we might summarise, we might repeat back a certain word. So if they say, talk for 5 minutes, but within there they say, I'm really looking for some clarity, we might just play back, so you're looking for clarity. Now, within that space, they have the time to think. So we're offering them more time to think and more opportunity to reflect on what's just been played back to them, because they may not be aware of what they've just said. Sounds a bit weird, but people often talk, they say they come to the coaching room, they'll talk for 5 minutes, you'll play back something they've said a few minutes into it. They go, did I say that? Really? Oh yes. Well, no, and yes, that is what I think. So they're hearing it back for the first time, which creates some space in the coaching room, and it gives us time to think as a coach as well. One of the biggest problems I find with coaches learning to coach is that getting lost in thinking about what the next question is. So they've suddenly stopped listening to the person in front of them because they think, oh my God, I'm going to have to ask another question. Whereas if we just focus on listening in order to play back, we can forget about what the next question is.
So how long have you gone for in a coaching session without asking a question?
So the longest, and I can still recall where I was and who it was, the longest I've gone without asking anything, without getting involved at all, and I've just nodded and grunted and made noises to let them know I'm listening, is an hour.
Wow.
And I could see the cogs were turning. I could see, so it was a guy who was thinking about his career choices. He had an IT background, but had moved into construction and was getting a bit caught up in the construction stuff and wondering whether to go back to IT. And he just got lost in his thought process around that. And all sorts of things came in. His granddad came into it. He just got lost in his thinking. But I could see that he was making sense of it as he went along. And at the end of the hour, he said, "That was fantastic. Thank you so much." I had nothing to do with it. I was just there listening.
It sounds lovely and quite a privilege to be holding that space. So if we think about it as an approach, when might it be used in the coaching room?
I think the most obvious place for it to be used, even if you don't think you have a person-centred approach, I think the most obvious place for it to be used would be at the beginning of your coaching, when the coachee comes into the room and you want to hear their story. So they come wanting to tell their story. They've got something going on in their life that's not sitting comfortably with them, and they want to let you know about it. So that's a great time to use the person-centred approach and just stay out of the way and let them tell their story. Now, once they've told their story, we might choose to use a different approach. So a solution-focused approach might be more appropriate if we want to move the coachee on. But at the beginning of the session, it's really about letting them just talk. So many medics will have come across this approach, this kind of twin track approach, in motivational interviewing. So that's something that's quite often talked about in medical circles. And the idea of motivational interviewing is that you allow the coachee to talk about their situation, and it may be, let's say, they want to give up smoking. So they'll tell you all about that, what's going on for them. And then there comes a point in that consultation where you assess their readiness for change and whether they really want to affect change. And then you might well move on to a solution-focused approach. So in a consultation, it could be, okay, well, we have a number of options. We have patches, we have vaping, we have group therapy, hypnotherapy. Which one do you think you prefer? Now, we're not going to do that in the coaching room because that's about offering solutions. We are going to ask the coachee what options they have and draw the options out of them. So yesterday I was coaching with someone and they had a couple of options, but I was then asking them, okay, what other options do you have? And what else could you do? And before we knew it, we'd got 7 different options that all came from them. I didn't get involved in giving options at all. So I think the person-centered approach is really helpful at the beginning of a conversation. As I've just explained, I've spent a whole hour just listening to someone, which is very much a person-centered approach. But it may be that it's time to move on and we want to explore things in a different way. So we might bring in a different approach at that point.
And I suppose that idea of summarising, of playing back, can be weaved into other approaches anyway, whenever we need clarity or the client needs clarity on what's being discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that I have quite a nice pattern now to my coaching. So when someone has talked for some time, I will summarise. If they've talked for less time, I will just maybe play back a word or just label what they've been said by saying it sounds like or what I'm hearing is, and just do a little bit of playing back and then ask a question on the back of that if I need to ask a question. What I often find is that having played back, they just go, oh yes, and start talking again. So I don't have to ask a question, which is a luxury in itself.
Excellent. So you've mentioned playing back, obviously listening and using the client's own language. What else is there about the person-centred approach that defines it that's important to be aware of?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think the person-centred approach underpins all coaching. And Carl Rogers had the notion that there were 6 necessary and sufficient conditions to have that sort of relationship, the coaching relationship, and for it to be effective. So Carl Rogers' 6 necessary and sufficient conditions were the client incongruity. So really that just means that there's something going on for the client that's not sitting right with them, whether that's a problem that they've got, a goal that they've got that they want to work towards. But there's something going on for them that they want to talk about.
So they need to be in, their decision is to be in the coaching room and discuss that.
And to bring something to the coaching room. They're not going to turn up and say, oh, my life's wonderful.
No.
So there's something going on for them. So that's the first element, client incongruity. And then the second element is the coach's congruency in the coaching room. So to show up as a coach, being ready and willing to listen to the person in front of you, to accept the person in front of you as a complete person, capable of doing their own thinking, and to hold that space for them. And as I said earlier on, not to have your own agenda. So if you are an organisational coach, being clear about who your client is in that space and working with the coachee rather than what the organisation might be wanting from the coachee. So to me, that's the coach's congruency. And then having some empathy for the person in front of you. So understanding why they might think and feel the way they do. It might not be how you would think and feel in that situation, but understanding why they have that view of the world. So a bit of empathy. Unconditional positive regard is something else that Carl Rogers felt was necessary. And this is just showing up and accepting the person for who they are and not sitting in judgment of them, not having an opinion of what they're doing, but just accepting that is their world. And he, interestingly, Carl Rogers did some work in South Africa during apartheid and actually sat with a police officer talking about his life. And Carl Rogers found it really difficult to hold that space. He didn't think he did a particularly good job of sitting with a South African police officer. But what he found out later was that conversation changed the police officer's life, and he went on to live a different life after that one conversation.
So he must have done a fairly good job.
Yeah. A little bit of imposter syndrome going on from there. And then the relationship is really important. So the rapport and trust that you have really within the coaching space, nothing can happen without that relationship. The coachee has to trust you, and you have to trust the coachee that they're being open and honest. It's very difficult to coach someone who's showing up with a mask on. We've got to get underneath the mask and allow them to be open and honest, and that's all about building that relationship. And the final thing is the client's perception that the coachee is with them, that they are empathetic, that they understand their situation, and that they are there to help.
Excellent. So they're the 6 kind of necessary and sufficient conditions, and I think most of us can recognise those elements from coaching. There's nothing in there that we would say, oh, that doesn't sound like coaching, even though it's from a therapy background.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'd say he was a therapist, he wasn't a coach, but he did take his work out into the wider world of conflict management and education. So it's not the domain of therapy. And I know people get a little bit twitchy about the difference between coaching and therapy. But I think those conditions, if we can build those into our coaching, then we're going to be doing good work.
Excellent. So would you say there was any time when the person-centred approach isn't the one to go for?
So as I said earlier, there may be times when, as a coach, you have that judgment that it's time to move on, that we need to be more future-focused. And actually, the storytelling is done. And we want to think about options, so we might use a more solution-focused approach of coming up with options and allowing the coachee to choose how they're going to move forward. So I think it's going to be a judgment call on the part of the coach as to how they continue. But we're not therapists. We're not going to sit week after week listening to the story, hoping that something shifts. Coaching is about encouraging people to move forward. So I think there are times when we will want to do something different.
Excellent. That's good to know. Well, thank you, Tom, for talking to us about this style of coaching. And I'm sure a lot of listeners who have had coaching or who've undertaken some coach training will recognise some or all of the elements that you've described.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they will. I say, even if they've never heard of person-centred coaching, I think many coaches out there using a non-directive approach will recognise all of the elements that I've been talking about.
Absolutely. So next time on this podcast, we are going to be doing our first coach interview, and it's one that I know you won't want to miss. So you can always subscribe so that you don't miss out on any episode.
Thank you, Helen. That's great. That's our first full podcast completed. So I look forward to working with you again next time.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
This has been a MonkeyPants Productions podcast.